The flower wagon tipped before Lena Hartwell ever saw the main house. One wheel dropped hard into a washout near the box elder gate. And the whole load leaned with a groan of wood and iron. For one cold second. Every sack of flour, sugar, dried apples, coffee, and salt slid toward the ditch while a brown Wyoming dust storm came rolling low across the road. Lena did not scream. She dropped from the wagon seat, caught the side rail with both hands, and shouted to the driver, "Hold the team steady." The man stared at her like she had spoken from inside a burning church. "Hold them," she said again. This time he listened. Dust hit them sideways. It stung her eyes and filled the folds of her black traveling dress. The wagon canvas snapped loose, whipping like a flag in hard wind. A sack of flour split open near the edge, spilling white across the road, where the dirt took it quick. Lena climbed onto the wheel hub, reached across the load, and dragged the canvas back over the sugar crates. "Dry goods first," she called. "Anything sweet goes under cover. Flour away from the ditch. Coffee last." No one moved. 3 ranch hands stood near the gate. Fine horses stamped behind them. Up on the porch of the big ranch house, a woman in a pale dress watched with one gloved hand resting on the rail. Lena turned toward the hands. "Unless Box Elder Ranch feeds 200 wedding guests on dust and regret. I need help now." That moved them. The nearest hand ran first. The others followed. Together, they shifted the sacks, one at a time, passing them down before the wagon could sink farther into the soft shoulder. Lena worked beside them. Sleeves rolled, hair coming loose under her plain bonnet. Both boots braced in the ditch mud. By the time the worst of the wind passed, the load was saved. Most of it. One flour sack lay open at her feet. The white powder had turned gray where dust found it. Lena crouched and pressed the seam with her fingers, checking what could still be used and what had to be thrown out. She hated waste more than hunger. Hunger, at least, told the truth. Waste was carelessness wearing a clean coat. A shadow fell across the road. "You handled that better than my freight man did," a man said. Lena looked up. He stood on the other side of the broken sack. Dull, sunbrowned, hat in hand now, though the wind still worried at his dark hair. His shirt was plain and his boots were worn down from work. Not polish. He looked at the wagon first, then the flour, then her hands. Not her waist. Not her face with that quick measuring look people thought she never noticed. Her hands. "I am paid to know what ruins food," Lena said. "And what saves it." "That too." He nodded once. "Gideon Rusk." "I know whose ranch this is." "You're Mrs. Hartwell." "Lena Hartwell." His eyes moved to the canvas roll tied near the wagon seat. Her knives were inside it. Beside them, wrapped in cloth, was her mother's red-handled skillet. The only thing she owned that had crossed 3 generations without being sold, pawned, or buried. "You came for the wedding feast," he said. "I came for the work." That was the cleaner truth. The letter from Box Elder Ranch had promised $40 for 6 weeks of preparation and 2 full days of service. $40 meant the back half of her mortgage note. $40 meant the tin roof over her bedroom might stop leaking before winter. $40 meant her 40 acres outside, Red Willow would remain hers a little longer. The woman from the porch came down the steps then. Vivian Ashcroft moved like the dust had no right to touch her. Pale gloves. Pale dress. A face calm enough to seem kind from a distance, and sharp enough to correct that mistake up close. "You must be the cook," Vivian said. "Yes, ma'am." Vivian looked at the road. The wagon. The saved crates. Then the gray flour spilled at Lena's feet. "I hope this is not how you intend to manage the wedding." Lena stood slowly. "No, ma'am. I intend to manage it better than the freight was managed." One of the ranch hands looked down fast, hiding something close to a smile. Vivian did not. "My mother's letter explained the terms." "It did. You will work from the rear cookhouse. Guests are not to see kitchen labor during the celebration. You will not enter the banquet yard unless called. You will not speak to railroad guests, investors, or family acquaintances. This is a formal affair." Mrs. Hartwell. Lena felt the old heat rise behind her ribs. The heat of being needed and unwanted at the same time. I understand, she said. Good. Vivian turned back toward the house. But Gideon stayed where he was. Lena bent to lift the damaged flour sack. Gideon reached for it at the same time. She stopped him with one look. I can carry it. I reckon you can, he said. I was going to ask where you wanted it. That answer made her pause. Only for a breath. Cookhouse, she said. Dry shelf. Not near the stove. He picked up the sack and carried it without another word. As Lena followed, she saw the mark stamped on the torn burlap. Ashcroft Rail Supply. She slowed. The contract had said Box Elder Ranch hired her. But the food had come through Ashcroft Freight. Lena looked toward the big house. Then toward the eastern meadow, where red survey stakes stood like small wounds in the grass. The wedding had not even begun. And already, something on this ranch was being sold. The cookhouse stood behind the main ranch house. Far enough from the guests' rooms that no fine dress would smell of smoke, grease, or honest work. Lena noticed that first. It was a strong building. Broad and low. With 2 iron stoves. A stone hearth. A long worktable scarred by years of knives. And a cold cellar door set into the floorboards. Whoever had built it had known what a kitchen needed. Whoever used the main house now seemed to have forgotten what a kitchen meant. She set her mother's red-handled skillet on the wall hook nearest the stove. Then she started counting. Flour sacks. Sugar. Coffee. Salt. Dried apples. Vinegar. Lard. Butter. Beans. Cornmeal. Hams hanging in the smokehouse. Preserved peaches and cherries packed in straw. 20 dozen eggs due in 3 days. Ice blocks promised twice a week from the springhouse. The numbers steadied her. Numbers did not whisper behind doors. Numbers did not look at a widow's dress and decide what she was worth. Numbers told the truth. So long as a person had courage enough to read them. By the second week, Lena had the cookhouse running like a small army. Before sunrise, smoke curled from the low stone chimney. By mid-morning, hams hung in the smokehouse under a careful applewood burn. Bread dough rested beneath damp cloths. Stock simmered low. Pie crusts chilled in the cellar. The dessert tower took shape slowly in her sketchbook. Not as Vivian wanted it, but as Wyoming heat would allow it to stand. Vivian had sent an illustration from St. Louis. It showed a tall white tower with sugar columns thin as icicles. Glassy ribbons. And flowers stacked in impossible layers. It was a pretty lie. In July heat, it would lean before the second toast and fall before the first dance. Lena studied it for half a minute and set it aside. She was testing a stronger base with hidden iron support from the blacksmith when the cookhouse door opened. Gideon Rusk stood in the doorway. Hat low. Coat dusty from the cattle meadow. Morning, he said. You lost? No. Hungry. Not enough to trouble you. She kept working the sugar paste between her fingers. Then why are you standing in my doorway? Mr. Rusk. He looked toward the smokehouse window, where the first light had turned the hanging hams dark gold. Smoke's running hot. Lena stopped. Most men would have said the fire looked fine because flames comforted fools. Gideon had seen the difference. It was, she said. I cut it down 10 minutes ago. He stepped inside. Not far. Applewood. With a little hickory. Too much hickory makes it bitter. He nodded like that mattered. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt like both of them were listening to the same thing from different sides of the room. You learned on trail crews? He asked. My mother fed cattle crews when I was small. My grandmother cooked her way west before there was a roof over anyone's head. Between them, I learned a hungry man complains less when the bread is right. That true? No. Lena said. But he complains quieter. A corner of his mouth moved. Barely. Then the far door opened hard enough to strike the wall. Vivian Ashcroft entered with the St. Louis illustration in one gloved hand. Her pale riding skirt had never touched mud. Her eyes went first to Gideon. Then to Lena. Then to the sugar paste on the table. I was told the dessert design had been changed. Vivian said. Adapted. Lena answered. That is a polite word for disobedience. It is a practical word for standing upright. Vivian's gaze sharpened. The design came from St. Louis. The heat did not. Gideon said nothing. But Lena felt his attention settle on the table like weight. Vivian stepped closer. This wedding is meant to impress men who have seen real society. I will not have it made small because a local cook is frightened of height. Lena laid both palms flat on the work table. If I build what is on that paper, it will fall. Maybe during the cutting. Maybe before. When it does, every guest will remember it. Not the flowers. Not the music. The fall. Vivian's face went still. You forget your place. No. Ma'am. Lena said. I remember it exactly. My place is making sure your table does not shame you. For a moment. The cookhouse held its breath. Vivian folded the illustration once. Slowly. Make it impressive, she said. And stay unseen. She left with the same hard grace she had carried in. Only after the door shut did Gideon move. He walked to the table and looked at Lena's sketch. A lower tower. Broader. Wrapped in climbing roses and sweet peas. Built to survive wind and heat. That one will stand, he said. It has to. It's better than hers. Lena looked up. You should not say that. I did not say it to her. That may be worse. His eyes stayed on the sketch. Maybe. Outside. A hammer struck metal near the barn. From farther off came the low call of cattle moving toward water. Gideon turned to go. Then stopped near the door. East Meadow is being surveyed this afternoon, he said. I saw the stakes. You see more than most. I count what others waste. He looked back at her. And for the first time, the guarded rancher seemed tired under the hat brim. Then count this, he said quietly. A wedding can hide more than a bride. By noon. Lena understood. 3 men in city coats rode out past the cookhouse toward the greenest meadow on Box Elder land. One carried a rolled map. One carried a red bundle of stakes. The third wore an Ashcroft pin on his vest. Lena stood at the smokehouse door with sugar dust on her fingers. The hams swung gently in the heat behind her. And down in the meadow, the first red stake went into the ground. By the 4th week, the wedding had stopped feeling like a celebration being prepared. It felt like a fence being built around something. Lena could feel it in the way the ranch hands lowered their voices when Ashcroft riders came through the yard. She could see it in the freight invoices, stacked near the pantry door with neat numbers and strange markings. She could hear it in the main house after supper, when men spoke softly in the parlor, and the floorboards carried enough sound to tell her there was trouble, but not enough to name it. The red stakes in East Meadow stayed in her mind. They did not belong there. That meadow was the only green sweep of land left after 3 hard weeks without rain. The creek bent shallow along its lower edge. And the grass there still held color when everything beyond it had turned brittle. Cattle drifted toward it at sundown like they knew where life remained. A railroad line through that meadow would not just cut land. It would cut the ranch's throat slowly. Lena was carrying vinegar jars down to the cold cellar when she found the map. It had been shoved into the wrong crate, wrapped between 2 bundles of waxed paper. At first she thought it was a supply sheet. Then she saw the dark line drawn across the page. Straight as a threat. Box, Elder, East, right-of-way. The line ran through the meadow, crossed the spring run, and marked a strip wide enough for rail, storage sheds, and a loading spur. At the bottom, in clean ink, was a place for Gideon Rusk's signature. Lena stood with the map in both hands. Behind her, the cookhouse fire popped once. She folded the paper exactly as she had found it and set it beneath the vinegar jars. Not hidden. Not stolen. Just waiting. Gideon came before dusk. He had dust on his sleeves and a tightness around his mouth that had not been there in the mornings. Lena was trimming fat from cured ham. Knife moving clean and steady. You knew about the map, she said. He stopped. For a moment, he did not answer. Yes. That meadow keeps your cattle alive. Yes. And they want it as part of the marriage. His eyes moved to the window, where the last light lay low over the yard. They call it a settlement. he said. Vivian's father calls it progress. The railroad calls it a necessary spur. What do you call it? Gideon looked back at her. My father's best grass. The answer was quiet. That made it heavier. Lena wiped her knife and set it down. Then why are the stakes still there? He leaned one hand on the edge of the table. Because refusing a thing is simple until 200 people are riding in for a wedding. Half the county is watching. Your banknote is due after the fall drive. And the freight company bringing your winter supplies belongs to the man asking you to sign. Lena understood too well. Need could make a person stand still while someone else rearranged their life. Before she could answer, Vivian entered from the side hall. She looked from Gideon to Lena. Then to the table between them. The cookhouse seems to have become a council room, she said. Gideon straightened. We were discussing supplies. How practical. Vivian walked to the cold cellar door and glanced at the crates. My father's men say the meadow survey will finish tomorrow. The notary arrives 2 days before the ceremony. It would be best if there were no unpleasant delays. Lena saw Gideon's jaw move once. Vivian saw it too. Her voice softened. But not kindly. You knew what this marriage would require. Gideon. I knew there would be terms. I did not know your father meant to take water. He means to bring rail access. That raises the value of everything you own. Not if what I own cannot feed cattle. Vivian looked tired for one brief second. Not weak. Not sorry. Just tired of pretending the knife was not a knife. Land changes hands every year, she said. Families survive by knowing when to let go. Lena looked down at her own hands. 40 acres. A leaking roof. A mortgage note folded in a drawer back home. Some land was not acreage. It was the last proof a person had not been beaten flat. Vivian turned to Lena. And you need not trouble yourself over matters above your station. Lena held her gaze. No. Ma'am, she said. I only trouble myself over what ruins a meal. Vivian's eyes narrowed. Lena looked toward the window, where the meadow showed beyond the barn. And what starves a ranch? The silence held too long. Gideon did not smile. He did not defend her. But something in his face changed. As if a door inside him had opened and let in weather. That night, Lena saw him from the cookhouse window. He stood alone near the horse barn while a buyer led away his best draft team. No announcement. No complaint. Just a handshake. A folded bill. And 2 strong horses taken down the road. The next morning, Esther told her the truth. He sold them so payroll clears, she said. And so, your wages are ready before the wedding. Lena said nothing. Because Vivian had already let her believe Ashcroft money was paying for everything. Now Lena understood the shape of the sacrifice. Gideon had been protecting her pay while standing on land. Everyone wanted him to surrender. Outside, in East Meadow, the last red stake went into the ground. And inside the cookhouse, under the vinegar jars, the unsigned deed waited like a match near dry grass. The wedding morning came pale and windless. That worried Lena more than dust. Dust announced itself. Wind gave warning. Still, heat just sat over a ranch and waited for something to break. Bidon. The cookhouse was already alive. Hams rested under clean cloth. Bread stood in rows beside the stone hearth. Pies cooled on the long shelf near the cold cellar door. The dessert tower waited in the center of the table. 4 strong tiers wrapped in pale roses and sweet peas. Held steady by a blacksmith's iron hoop no guest would ever see. That suited Lena. Most strong things did their work hidden. Esther Pike came in carrying a tray of polished knives and stopped when she saw it. Well, she said quietly. That will shut a few mouths. No, Lena said, adjusting one sugar leaf. It will fill them. Esther looked at her for a moment. Then gave a dry little nod. Same thing. Some days. By mid-morning, wagons had filled the yard. Guests came in from Red Willow, Cheyenne, Laramie, and smaller places that had no names on maps but sent men who knew cattle, weather, and debt. Ladies moved beneath parasols. Railroad men stood near the parlor doors in dark coats. Too clean for the country. August, Ashcroft arrived last. Silver-haired and broad through the chest. smiling as if the whole ranch had already signed itself over. Lena watched none of it for long. She had work. Course after course, left the cookhouse through the back passage. Esther and 2 ranch hands carried platters to the banquet yard under the white canvas tent. Every time the door opened, sound poured in. Fiddle strings. Glass. Boots on plank flooring. The rising murmur of 200 people deciding they were impressed. No one asked for Lena. That had been the bargain. Then the cake went out. It took 4 men to carry it steady. Lena stood with one hand on the doorframe and watched the tower disappear into the hall of voices. She had done all she could. It had held through heat. Through travel. Through judgment. It would hold through the cutting too. She untied her apron for one breath of rest. That was when Vivian Ashcroft began to speak. Her voice carried clearly through the boards. Bright. Polished. Practiced. My friends. Vivian said. Before this day moves forward, I must thank everyone who helped bring such refinement to a place as rugged as Box Elder. Gentle laughter followed. Lena stood still. I know many of you have praised the meal. I am pleased you noticed the standard. It took careful direction to ensure that local hands could meet expectations fit for our guests. A smaller laugh moved through the tent. Esther, standing near the wash basin, looked at Lena. Lena did not move. Vivian continued. Warmer now because the room had given her permission. Our cook has worked hard. I will grant her that. Some women are suited to plain labor. And there is no shame in being useful when one understands one's place. The laughter came again. Not loud. Worse. Comfortable. Lena looked at her red-handled skillet hanging on the wall. Her mother had used it to feed men who came in frozen from winter range. Her grandmother had carried it west wrapped in a flour sack. Neither woman had asked society to admire them. But no one had laughed at the work while eating from it. Vivian's voice softened into something almost kind. So let us be grateful for capable hands behind closed doors. And for the guidance that makes such hands presentable. That was enough. Lena folded her apron once and laid it on the table. Esther crossed the room. Lena. No. You should not leave before being paid. I will not stand here and be turned into the price of my own wages. Her voice did not shake. She was grateful for that. She wrapped her knives in cloth. She took down the red-handled skillet and held it against her side. For 6 weeks. She had kept that cookhouse running before sunrise and past dark. She had saved their flour. Their feast. Their name before guests who would never know hers. Now she was done. The back door opened before she reached it. Gideon stood there in his wedding coat. Face still but not calm. You heard. He said. So did everyone. She had no right. Rights have little to do with rooms like that. He stepped inside. Lena. No. She kept her hand on the doorframe. Do not make this easier for yourself by being kind to me now. That struck him harder than anger would have. I am not going back to stand beside her. He said. Lena looked at him then. For a second. All the noise outside seemed far away. The guests. The railmen. The fiddle gone quiet. The waiting deed in the parlor. You are? She said. His jaw tightened. You think I should? I think a man ought to face the room he helped build. He lowered his eyes once. Then lifted them again. What if the wrong room is the one waiting for me? The question sat between them like a match dropped near dry straw. Lena opened the door. Sunlight hit the skillet in her arms. Red handle worn smooth by women who had stayed standing through worse than laughter. Then choose carefully. Mr. Rusk. She said. Because after today, no one here gets to pretend they did not know. She walked out into the hard afternoon. Behind her. After one long silence, Gideon turned back toward the banquet yard. Gideon Rusk did not hurry back to the banquet yard. That was what made the room quiet before he spoke. Men could smell a decision when it came walking slow. The fiddle had already stopped. Vivian stood beneath the canvas with her glass still in hand. Her smile fixed in place. Waiting for him to smooth over what she had said. August, Ashcroft stood near the parlor doors with 2 railroad men behind him. One holding a leather folder. The other a silver pen case. The notary had already opened his book. Gideon looked at the long tables first. Every plate carried Lena's work. Every loaf. Every ham slice. Every preserved peach. Every piece of that standing tower Vivian had nearly made fall before it was ever built. Then, he looked at Vivian. You will not speak of her that way again. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Vivian's smile thinned. Gideon. This is hardly the time. It is exactly the time. A low sound moved through the guests. Not shock yet. Something smaller. The first shift of a room realizing the day had left its proper road. August, Ashcroft stepped forward. Rusk. Whatever private discomfort you have, can wait until after business is concluded. Gideon turned to him. No. That one word did what a shout could not. It made every person listen. August's face hardened. You gave your word. I gave my word to consider terms after the ceremony. The ceremony is done. The marriage is not. Vivian lowered her glass. Gideon walked to the parlor table. The deed lay there. Smooth and white. With its blank line waiting at the bottom. Beside it sat the right-of-way map. Rolled tight with a red ribbon. He untied the ribbon. The paper opened across the table. Showing East Meadow split by black ink. Rail spur. Storage strip. Temporary access. Words neat enough to hide hunger if a man did not know his own land. This is not a wedding settlement. Gideon said. It is a cut through the best water grass on box elder. It takes the spring run first. The loading ground second. And the rest by pressure. Once cattle can't hold weight through summer. One of the railroad men cleared his throat. That is a dramatic description of ordinary expansion. Gideon looked at him. You ever wintered cattle on short grass? The man did not answer. That is what I thought. August put one hand on the deed. You are making a fool of yourself before your neighbors. No. Gideon said. I nearly made one of myself in silence. Outside the tent. A wagon wheel creaked. Somewhere beyond the yard. Cattle bawled from the meadow. Low and restless. As if even they had heard the line drawn through their water. Vivian's face had changed. The anger was there. Bright under her skin. But something else stood behind it now. A woman watching a door close and finally understanding she had been pushed toward it too. My father did not force you to court me. She said. No. Gideon answered. He did not. And I did not force you to let this go as far as it did. No. The honesty cost him. Lena was not there to see it. But Esther Pike was standing by the cookhouse passage. And she saw enough for both of them. Gideon took the silver pen from the table. For one breath. The whole yard held still. Then he set it down beside the deed. Untouched. I will not sign. August's voice dropped cold. You will regret this before the first frost. Likely. Freight can become expensive. So, can a reputation for using a wedding to take water? That landed harder than the refusal. Several ranchers at the nearest table looked at the map now. Not at Gideon. One leaned forward. Another whispered to his wife. The railroad man with the pen case closed it slowly. Vivian looked at the guests. Then toward the cookhouse passage. She made the feast. She said. August turned sharply. Vivian. But she kept going. I chose the tone. I chose the flowers for the tables. I chose who was invited. But I did not make this meal. Her voice did not soften. It simply became cleaner. Lena Hartwell did. And what I said was false before it was cruel. The words did not repair the day. But they changed the air inside it. Gideon left the parlor table and walked through the back passage to the cookhouse. Lena stood inside with her skillet and knife roll on the table. Not gone. Not staying. Just waiting because Esther had found her on the road and brought her back through the side gate. Gideon stopped at the threshold. The deed is unsigned. He said. Lena did not answer at once. Because of me. No. He said. Because of East Meadow. Because of my father's land. Because of what she said. Because I was tired of calling fear by better names. That was the first thing he had said all day that did not ask anything from her. He took an envelope from his vest and placed it on the work table. Your wages. Full amount. And payment for the flour you saved and the ironwork you had made. Lena looked at the envelope. Charity. Earned money. She picked it up. Outside, the first guests began leaving. Wheels turned in dust. Harness chains sounded from the yard. The great wedding of Box Elder Ranch came apart not with thunder, but with people deciding where they would stand when the story was told later. Vivian appeared once in the cookhouse doorway. Her face was pale. Her voice stayed steady. What you made today was finer than I deserved. Lena held her gaze. Yes, she said. It was. Vivian nodded, as if that answer was fair, and walked away. When the door closed, Gideon and Lena stood with the work table between them. Nothing was fixed, but the lie had lost its seat at the table. The new tin roof went on Lena Hartwell's farmhouse 11 days after the wedding that did not finish. She climbed the ladder before sunrise with a hammer, a pouch of nails, and the last ache of Box Elder still sitting under her ribs. The old roof had leaked over the back bedroom for 2 winters. Every rain had found the same weak seam and filled the same dented bucket one patient drop at a time. By noon, the seam was covered. By sundown, the bucket hung empty on a nail beside the stove. Lena stood in the yard with dust on her skirt and a bruise darkening one thumb, looking up at the roof like it was more than tin. It was proof. She had been paid. Not pitied. Paid. For 11 days. She worked her 40 acres. Patched the henhouse. Weeded the garden. And told herself, Box Elder Ranch was behind her. Some mornings, she almost believed it. Then Esther Pike came in a wagon. She brought flour, coffee, 2 jars of cherries, and a folded handbill from Laramie. I did not come from Gideon, Esther said before Lena could ask. Lena set the coffee pot on the stove. That sounds like something a woman says when she came from Gideon. Esther gave her a dry look. I came from myself. He is too proud to send me and too decent to ask. She slid the handbill across the table. Lena opened it. Cattleman's Fall Supper, prepared by Mrs. Lena Hartwell of Red Willow. Her name sat there in black ink. Not hidden behind a door. Not swallowed by a richer woman's toast. Printed plain enough for any man in 3 counties to read. Lena touched the paper once with the tips of her fingers. They want 60 plates. Esther said. Good pay. Better than Box Elder. Lena looked at the number written at the bottom. It was enough to fix the smokehouse. Maybe enough to hire help. Maybe enough to stop living from one patch thing to the next. How is he? Lena asked before she could stop herself. Esther's face softened. Though not too much. She was not that kind of woman. Working. Quiet. Ashcroft freight raised prices. But not as high as they threatened. Why not? Too many ranchers saw the map. Esther wrapped both hands around her cup. Men who live by water get nervous when railroad ink comes near a creek. 3 ranches moved their freight accounts last week. The general store in Red Willow stopped keeping Ashcroft credit slips on the counter. Lena looked toward the window. Justice had not arrived with a bell. It had arrived through small choices made by people who had finally seen enough. And Vivian? Lena asked. Gone east with her father. Left 1 letter behind. Said the feast was yours. Said any man who claimed otherwise was lying. Lena looked down at the handbill again. It did not heal everything. But it stood. 2 days later. She went into Red Willow for nails and lamp oil. Mr. Cray at the general store looked up from his ledger and did not call her widow Hartwell or Daniel's Lena or the cook from that wedding. He said. Morning. Mrs. Hartwell. Heard Laramie wants your table next. Nothing grand followed. No apology. No speech. But a woman near the flower bins turned to look at Lena with new understanding. And by the time Lena left, Mr. Cray had written her order under her own name in the account book. That evening, Lena pinned the handbill beside the stove. 3 days later, Gideon Rusk came to her south fence with a wagon full of plank boards. Lena saw him from the porch. He stopped at the gate and did not come through until she nodded. Morning, he said. Morning. He looked thinner than before. Not weak. Just worn by choices that had started collecting their price. What are the boards for? Lena asked. Smokehouse. Esther said, yours won't hold 60 plates of meat. Esther talks too much. She talks accurately. Lena folded her arms. You came to repair my smokehouse. No. He rested one hand on the gate. I came to ask if I may. That was why she let him in. They worked until evening. He measured. She marked. He held boards while she drove nails straight. No one spoke of the wedding for a long time. The quiet was not empty. It was work finding its own language. Near sundown, Lena brought coffee to the porch. Gideon sat on the step. Hat beside him. Hands wrapped around the cup. Box elder will have a hard fall. He said. I heard. Freight costs more now. The bank will not like the missing Ashcroft money. I may have to sell cattle early. Lena watched the light settle across her fields. Do you regret it? He looked toward the road. Then back at her. I regret letting it go that far. That answer stayed between them because it was the right one. I am not asking you to come to Box Elder. He said. No. No. Your name is traveling on its own now. It ought to keep doing that. He looked at her. I am asking whether I can stand near the road it takes. She did not answer quickly. She thought of Vivian's toast. Of the unsigned deed. Of East Meadow still green under cattle hooves. Of her grandmother's skillet. Red handle, worn, smooth. Hanging by the stove behind her. I do not know how to be chosen without waiting for the other hand to close. She said. Gideon nodded once. Then I will keep mine open. That was all. No speech. No promise big enough to frighten the truth out of the air. Just an open hand and a porch at sundown. In October, they married on Lena's 40 acres. Not at Box Elder. Not under a canvas tent. Not before railroad men with maps in their pockets. The minister stood by the straightened south gate. Esther cried and blamed the wind. A few neighbors came with bread, beans, and coffee. Mr. Cray, from the general store, brought a sack of flour with Lena's name written clean across the tag. Lena wore her blue Sunday dress. And beneath it, tied at her waist where no one could see, her mother's old apron. After the vows, Gideon reached for her hand carefully. Like a man who knew the difference between holding and claiming. Behind them, on the farmhouse wall, the red-handled skillet hung above the Laramie handbill. Outside, the late Wyoming light touched the new tin roof, the repaired smokehouse, and the fence that stood true against the wind. For the first time in years, Lena Hartwell did not feel like a woman waiting for something to be taken. She felt like a woman whose name had finally learned the road. This is a fictional story created for entertainment. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.